Welcome back, everyone. My name is Joseph Orosco. I'm a professor of philosophy at Oregon State University, and I'm the co-director of the Anarres Project for Alternative Futures. The Anarres Project is a forum for conversations, initiatives, and projects that imagine a future free of exploitation, domination, oppression, war, and empire. One of the things we do at the Anarres Project is this conversations with organizers, scholars, and social change agents about the possibility of making alternative futures. Today, a very special discussion post the 2020 presidential elections about the future of racial and economic justice moving ahead. My guests are Alejandro Jose Gradilla and Teka Lo. Alejandro Jose Gradilla is Associate Professor of Chicana and Chicano Studies at Cal State Fullerton. He received his PhD from UC Berkeley in Ethnic Studies, and his research focuses on the impacts of dehumanization on Mexican origin people in the United States. Teka Lo is someone who should be familiar as a longtime collaborator with the Anarres Project. Her poetry collection, The Queen of Inglewood, was published in 2017, and she's been a writer with us for almost 5 years now. And her political commentary can be found in LA Weekly, Counterpunch, Truthdig, USA Today. And she's now the editor of a new website, publicintellectuals.org. Welcome to both of you. I thank you for being here and taking time to speak with us.
Thank you. Thank you for having us. This is great, especially the great timing.
No, when I thought about trying to think about, who could I ask for commentary about what's going on in the world at this particular moment, I know that both of you have very sort of active social media presence and run commentary a lot. And so I wanted to capture your thoughts on this kind of question, right? So here we are just about a few days out from the official media declaration that the projections of the elector votes are going to be that Joe Biden is the winner. But we're seeing that President Trump is refusing to acknowledge a loss, is doubling down and doing all these sorts of changes to personnel in the government that suggest that he does not want to give up power. So I don't want to talk so much about the electoral issues here, but thinking about what the election results mean, what do they indicate, and what we might think moving ahead for racial and social justice, given what some of these election results indicate. So, regardless of whatever electoral results take place, right, the exit poll data indicates that President Trump increased his popularity this year in 2020 over 2016 with almost all demographic groups except for white men. Right, so it decreased just a little bit, but in almost all cases, including groups of color, and I've seen also with LGBTQ folk, right, his popularity increased. So my question, I guess, is what do you think this means about the political reality of the United States at this moment? What should we be cautious about, considering that more than, say, 70 million voters opted to remain in the Trump camp with the message and the sort of political leanings that he represents? That, at least 70 million, one of the highest number, right? We had one of the highest record numbers of voter turnout in this election in almost US history. What does that reality indicate about where we are in the United States today? Alejandro, can you start off with this?
Sure. No, I think there's some key lessons here. And one of the things that we can see in terms of kind of the Trump effect, right? The Trump effect is what I kind of see as kind of finally peeling the skin off of what we assume to be like, oh, the US is this democracy and oh my goodness, it's an aberration. And I think what Trump was very effective at doing is kind of removing all of the kind of the genteel aspects of what was actually being done in terms of conservative politics. I think one of the things that we have done a very poor job of, and this is where I'm going to intersect with the question of social media, is the issue that social media, for anybody who has not seen The Social Dilemma, and there are other documentaries focusing on the role of social media and its role of manipulation of reality, is that for us on the organized left, or those of us who feel that we're part of a left movement, one of the failures of our movement, comparing the work that we used to do in the 1980s and 1990s, as opposed to this current, social media information age period, is one of the jobs of the left has always been tracking the right. And one of the things that has disappeared is that analysis of what are elements on the right that we need to be aware of? What are some moves that are being made in terms of authoritarianism? And we've almost been quite silent. I mean, the only person I've been tracking on this has been Angela Davis, who has been constantly reminding us that, we're doing too much navel gazing, and we need to really go out and think about what does it mean when this secret deal with this, foreign country has been done. Those are the old school things that we used to do in terms of, and I always remember my old left newsletters and newspapers from the 80s and 90s was, there was always this a discussion about the implications. What are the implications of, right? What were the implications of this? We need to go back to that type of analysis, because we have to understand, what were people hearing, right? Why did he increase all of those demographics? And I think as we start peeling apart in terms of his growth and his popularity, we do have to understand, well, what's going on here? I do emphasize the fact that even though there have been bump ups in BIPOC populations and LGBTQ, the majority of the voters who support Trump are still white, right? That is still something very clear in the data. The other thing that's very clear, it is the very comfortable upper middle class, right? The data shows people over 100,000, but below 400,000 are the ones who voted for Trump, right? So this is no longer the question of the poor working class white person, right? Which is kind of a trope that the media likes to play out, right? Oh, it's the, Joe the plumber type of person, right? Well, the reality is it's not. It's still the suburban person with power and privilege who has benefited from the tax cuts of Trump, who wants to see more of that, right? What are we seeing? We've seen blue collar people, people who are making under 100,000, who live in urban areas and ex-urb areas, who voted overwhelmingly, right? These are the Bernie people, right? And so these are some of the things that I think we have to analyze. What does it mean if we were to intersect the Bernie folks with BLM, right? When we see that, we see this new progressive left-leaning majority that is younger, that is more agile, that is, willing to do direct action and make changes happen, right? But in this current mode, we're being distracted by all of this kind of, well, who voted for who and who did this, right? When we have to figure out, how do we pull these people in? And in the university, this is my kind of goal and agenda, is how do we bring that energy and fire into the university so that we can transform what higher education is, right? Because the university needs to be shook up like Bernie shook up many places, as well as BLM, right? We have yet to be untouched by that. And there are other issues that I'll bring up later on in the conversation, but I do think there is an urgency. What we're seeing today is the 30-year attack on higher education. You have this middle class that is only interested in making money and making money for themselves. And we no longer have this desire of the civic engagement or the social good. That has collapsed. And I think this younger voter is seeing the need to have a social safety net and this larger civic good, right? How do we have a we, right? And that's the bigger question. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, Teka, what do you think?
First off, I think Alejandro's points are amazing and right on. For me, I love the 30-year mark because that is when, about 30 years ago, 1987 is when they got rid of the fairness doctrine in media. And media is kind of like my thing. Media, and then when you have Citizens United, where corporations get First Amendment rights and are able to give as much money as they can, want to, literally billions of dollars. So what we have is this kind of like horrible intersection between the Southern strategy, the fairness doctrine, Citizens United, a collapsing of media, and then you have the internet. So essentially what you have are powerful interests that are building this artificial, like echo chamber that magnifies the voices of people, but they aren't actually people. They're actually like the wishes of the wealthy, of the right wing. And the thing is, like, we're thinking, you know, it's kind of like this thing where we want to be like everyone else. So if you have millions of bots and just people in our, you know, in our space saying these right-wing things, then you start to move to the right. This is just like behaviorism. This is not even like, oh, these people are bad people. And I'll give you one anecdote, then we can go to the next question, because your answer was very thorough. I owned a newspaper in Inglewood, California, the Morningside Park Chronicle. And Jose knows this, but I write a lot. So I used to write my entire newspaper, which seemed insane. But I was also very into journalism ethics. Like that was like my big thing. I'm very into ethics. And something was really bizarre. This guy would come, and I was in the Black and Chicano neighborhood, and this guy would come, and he was Black, and he would give me free stories. And he seemed like a regular, and the thing is that a lot of local newspapers, because of, you know, the fact that they're losing advertising dollars and things like that, and they don't have that many writers. So these kind of people would come to your newspaper and offer you free stories. And I said, hey, this is like right-wing propaganda. It would be like stuff about taxes and like homosexuality. And I was like, this, and then I looked up the guy. I actually looked him up because I'm like, who's this dude? So I looked him up. He was an operative from the Republican Party, but I would see this stuff in other papers. It is in Los Angeles, around the neighborhood. I'd see it like in white-owned papers. I'd see it in Black-owned papers. So it wasn't like, oh, he was just coming to me. He was coming to everybody. And then we'll talk about a lot, you know, the next question, I'll go more to detail of why that was happening and why that's so important to what's happening right now and why we could actually be slightly hopeful. Okay.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think that's interesting. Actually, I think I want to talk a little bit more about this because you both sort of were talking about changes in the media that that create these kinds of artificial realities that are, in some sense, motivating people to think about their interests in particular kinds of ways. I want to talk about the media reaction to this exit poll data that took place right after the election, right? And so for a while, the media was focusing on stories that announced how certain Black and Latinx voters in particular states showed up for Trump in particular ways. So you saw this talking, of course, about Latinx folk in Florida, which they really meant Cubans, right? And then Mexican-American voters in Texas showing up for Trump in large numbers, right? But then you also I saw these posts on Facebook that were talking about how dramatic numbers of Black men were voting for Trump, when in fact it was maybe an increase of 2%, right? Which was about the same as Black women, but those weren't making the kinds of headlines that that Black men in particular were making in mainstream media. So I was just wondering, why do you think that there is this kind of concentration on focusing on these particular kinds of demographics in that kind of way? What do you think it leaves out of the picture for understanding the kind of racial reality that we're in the United States right now? Teka, we'll start with you.
Okay, I think one thing that's really interesting about that kind of commentary is they're trying to make it seem like it's not, that Trump is not a white supremacist type of idea. It's just a right-wing conservative idea. Everybody thinks that Black people, Latinos, and kind of like it's making it seem like normalizing a certain kind of discourse and making it seem like this is something that everyone thinks. Like, I mean, you know, I'm gonna go kind of like back into like in 1906, like this Francis Galton, and I hate bringing him up because he's a eugenist and he's horrible, but he observed this competition to guess an ox's weight at a country fair. 800 people like entered, and he kind of started running these tests, and he discovered the average guess was 1,197 pounds, which was extremely close to the ox's actual weight of 1,908. No, 1,198. And even closer than the participants' closest guess. So a political application of the parable of the ox weight contest is the Overton window. So the Overton window is a range of policies and politically acceptable to the mainstream population at a given time. And this window of discourse, what tends to be adopted as the combination of mean, median, and mode of the extremes. In the past, in order to push this window, they would do ads. But since the interweb has come into existence, people think of the internet as being a democracy. They even say, my First Amendment rights on Facebook and things like that. And no one suspects that a lot of these things, conversations, and even when you see, people talking about, oh, all Black men are racist. Oh, all Latinos are racist. People don't like, I have a lot of friends that are in consulting, and I know they're slick, all right? And if you're a lot, the trick with journalism is to be, which is different than being a scholar and an academic where, you have to actually, you do research. But people like me, like writers, our whole thing is being first and being original. So we just will say anything. Like literally a lot of journalists will just say anything. And if a person calls them on the phone, and this has happened to me. Hey Teka, it looks like Black men are Satan. I mean, I'm not saying, but would you like to go on this show and talk about that? Now we don't have tenure. We're journalists. We're whatever. How many times I've told the Fox News have stopped coming to me, but they used to come to me all the time and be like, hey Teka, do you want to talk about this? I'd be like, no. So I mean, you have this, I don't know if I'm saying it right, but you kind of have this encouragement of lying to fit the narrative in order to continue to push this story. They even make you decide what you're going to argue about. Like, oh, we're not going to talk about racism, or we're not going to talk about capitalism. We're not going to talk about all this money you put into the campaign. I mean, and I'm going to stop. But even I think about the narrative of how the campaign won with the grassroots. You notice something they leave out? They leave out, even though they talk about people in regards to race, for people of color, for Latino, Latinx people, for Chicanos, for Black people, for Native Americans, they leave out the money. See, Bloomberg gave us money, but you know why they leave that out? Because they want us to be magical, so they don't have to pay us. And see, they're even shaping that story so they could screw us. I mean, I'm sorry, I get them all excited, but I hope I answered the question and didn't just go off on some merry fairyland, because I do
good.
that.
Alejandro, what do you think? What do you think about the sort of media focus on this, these small little percentages of changes in BIPOC voting? Like, why the fascination with those kinds of changes? And as you mentioned, not so much on just the fact that white majorities are still going for Trump and increasing.
Absolutely. And I think it's the perfect storm in terms of some of these media accounts of particular Latino men and Black men voting for Trump. If we think about the social media narrative that we've been trapped in since 2010, right? Because this is kind of a demarcation mark where we became the product, right? So in terms of the science fiction moment, this is the Soylent Green moment. This is the To Serve Man, right? Remember that the famous thing, was it a Twilight Zone episode, right? Oh, here's a cookbook, To Serve Man, right? we are the filet mignon, right? Or the bologna, or whatever one is call ourselves, or the vegan fake meat or whatever. But one of the things that we have to see is, well, what's the narrative, right? We've had these ready-made narratives of toxic masculinity, of men are trash, right? And what I think we're now realizing is, oh, these are ready narratives to then, okay, let's add in, this, right? Let's add in, right? Black men, of course, Black men, right? This goes back to, people want to make these invented histories and narratives. Oh, because times of slavery, Black men had to do, and it's like, let's not do this, right? Because this is not what's going on here in terms of, especially when we look at the numbers and the impact. I do want to go back to Tika's point in terms of the more important story that's being buried by these, Black men and Latino men voted for Trump. I do think there are issues, but I don't think it explains anything about the Trump situation right now. Organizing, right? Look at Georgia, look at Arizona, and Philadelphia. That is where people of color hit the streets in organized levels because they knew the type of racism they were against. They knew what type of fascism they were up against. And they literally mobilized every single BIPOC person they could, right? The Arizona initiative to get voters out was the Native Americans, or the fact that the Navajo Nation had just come out of the COVID crisis on their reservation, and yet they were like, we're going to mobilize, right? They mobilized 70,000 votes. So this is the lesson for us on the left, or those of us who want to challenge authoritarianism or burgeoning fascism, is the only way you do this is not through hashtags, right? Or not through other type of initiatives. It's organizing community. That hasn't changed. That the whole aspect of organizing, right? We can look at the farm workers back in the 60s. We can look at what was going on in the civil rights movement, right? Martin Luther King wasn't going to do it by himself. People loved his speeches, right? Very important, but there was a lot of organizing, right? And that's kind of one of the mistakes of how we teach the civil rights movement, is that we still kind of do the great man, great woman perspective, and we leave out the fact that it was the everyday Black person in the South who had to decide when they woke up in the morning, am I going to do this, right? That is more important. And I think historians like Robin Kelly really hit it on the head when they talk about we need to look at the everyday person. So when we look at places like Arizona and Georgia, it was really a mass effort to get people on the ground, the everyday person who is not a person of privilege, not somebody who is shopping at Whole Foods, right? They are there and they're like, I'm going to come out and vote, right? And so the work that we have to think about is, and this is what the media distraction I think that Teka is talking about, right? We're taught to like, look over here, right? Look at the shiny object, as opposed to looking that, wow, how radical when people of color organize, and none of this weird social media identity politics stuff that's been going on. Black people, brown people, Asian people, Native people, progressive whites getting in the street, doing real work, is when we see social change happen, right? But the media doesn't want us to focus on the fact that, oh crap, when people organize, they can actually overturn things, right? Which was the other subtext of BLM this summer, right? It was like, oh, and now Confederate statues are coming down, right? That was done to appease BLM protesters because yes, they probably were gonna, symbolically burn it down. But I think this was, you can see the summer was an example of how do you tamper down a organic left movement, right? That became popular, right? The fact that you saw all these, what I would call the white girl demographic, right? Even the white girls were out there, right? And once you realize how popular that became, then you started seeing, oh, statues coming down. Oh, we have nothing to do with the Confederacy anymore, right? I found that really telling and amazing in terms of, oh, okay, they're getting concessions without even realizing there was concessions to be gained. So I think all of this shows in terms of why organic organizing has to be something that we still use. Whether or not we get media attention or not, we still have to do that. So being organized, and yes, the hyper fetishizing of men of color does not surprise me, because again, think about how media likes to talk about the gangster, right? The Black gangster and the Latino male gangster, right? MS-13, whatever. So in many ways, this idea, this trope is just kind of another, oh, they are monsters. Okay, this verifies it, right? Hollywood verifies it, the media representation, and now we are verifying men of color are monsters, right?
Yeah, I like the focus that you bring on this, a question about organizing and getting people out on the streets. We saw some of this right here nearby where I'm at in Portland, right, where you started to see thousands of people coming off, and there were there were the anarchists out there, because I know some of those people. Those are some of my friends that are doing that, some of my students. But what was interesting was then you started to see a lot of organizing amongst these kinds of suburban moms showing up, the white mom walls and things like this, and the suburban dads. And so there did seem to be this kind of organic growing movement going on that then became shattered and fragmented for a variety of different kinds of reasons. But one of them was the repression, of course, got much more severe, right? And so it was very difficult for a lot of people to show up to these protests who weren't fully loaded up on anti-ballistic armor and helmets. And so it became very difficult for the moms and the dads to show up to these kinds of things with their children. These kinds of things make me wonder then, a question that I have for you is, thinking about organizing, an interesting kind of exit poll data that was done was it showed that about 40% of labor households voted for Trump.
Mhm.
So that's still right amongst labor households. A lot of folks voted for Biden, but for many working class people, it seemed as though Trump represented something that they could latch onto, right? So given these kinds of questions about organizing and labor unions, what do you think this suggests about moving ahead in the future for organizing? What sort of progress towards racial and economic justice are possible under all these conditions that we're talking about? Alejandro, we'll start with you, and then Tika.
Sure. No, and I think this is where, for those people who have been following, the literature on intersectionality, right? People like to think, oh, intersectionality is about me and my identity. It's kind of like it's the hallmarking, right, of intersectionality. Intersectionality actually directs us to do is look at the power structures, right? And one of the things that we can say in terms of our organizing is one of the new kind of hyped up beasts, if you will, of the right is higher education, right? They hate higher education. And so they've convinced people that, oh, those people in higher education think they're better than you, right? And I think when we think about a multi-sided struggle and a multi-sided, social movements, right, in the plural, we really have to think about how are we going to do this, right? How are we going to challenge a lot of the pushback that we're getting from communities that here in California, luckily, the labor movement is tied into a lot of higher education activists, right? So that my faculty union, my faculty at Cal State, the Cal State system, we are organized under collective bargaining. So we have a faculty union, and that allows for a lot of progressive politics to occur. The CFA, let's get a shout out to my CFA. But one of the things that I think is critical for us is that we don't have to think too hard in terms of how do we do this, right? It's like, Alejandro, how are you proposing to include higher ed, labor, and all these? All we have to do is look back to the 1980s and 1990s. Again, I'm not fetishizing that time period, but we had Jesse Jackson and the Rainbow Coalition who brought together forces that seemed in opposition, but he did it, right? So it can be done. And I think the other example is the anti-apartheid movement. You had organized labor, saying we do not support the white supremacist apartheid government of South Africa, right? And we want to free Nelson Mandela, right? That was something that cut across so many progressive sectors and brought people together. Those moments, I'm remembering back as a student activist, right? I would be sitting in these, meetings, and it would be a bus driver, a teacher, myself, nurses, and it's like, where are these moments, right? In particular, I mean, I was involved in a lot of Oakland activist work, and the Oakland community, the African American community, was very clear in terms of we need all sectors of progressives to come out. So we have to go back to that. But it's so funny because social media has made it so that we are so hyper fragmented that we don't see the collective benefit of solidarity, right? Now people call out solidarity. Solidarity is about silencing me, right? No, solidarity is about coming together to make sure that we don't have authoritarianism or fascism, right? That's where the left has to keep on saying. It's like, our job is not to be in charge of everything or, whatever, dictate to other people. But one of the checks and balances politically that we have to do as people of the left is keep out the right, right? And we saw the kind of the massive distortion of what Antifa is, right? But the everyday thing, I mean, that's why as somebody who is on the left, I vote, right? Because part of my job is to make sure that we block the extremists from taking over in terms of the right-wing extremists. So there is a roadmap. We have to re-examine solidarity, re-examine united fronts, and be able to really collaborate and build those, those struggles, because we're operating too often in our own silos.
Tika, what do you think is the future for racial economic justice, given some of the kinds of conditions that we find ourselves in right now?
To me, I am and this might be opposite of everybody else, but I'm really, really hopeful. We had an amazing turnout, and essentially what I've been saying for decades. I said, Arizona is flippable. I said, I even think Texas, I feel like they stole Texas. I understand the narrative, but I know people came out in Texas. I know that the Mexican-American community came out in Texas. There may have been a section that wasn't. I mean, I feel like that even, there's diversity within Latinos, there's diversity within the Mexican-American culture. I know they came out, and I know because, Texas was where they had to go and fight to extend the Voting Rights Act, because they're so racist. So I mean, I'm a little bit, I don't know if I believe Texas, but I'm saying that was amazing. You look at Georgia, that was amazing. And the thing is that, that people think that, oh, it's the progressives or the radicals and, and the centrists fighting. And it's not that. I mean, I tell people, literally the last time I looked where it was actually on record, to get the Black vote, it was literally 0.1% of the budget. I'm not one, like 0.1%. And I'm going to bet cash money they spent less on the Mexican American, not Latino, because Mexican American is the highest group of people. They like to play games. I'm not letting them play games with me. They know they didn't give any money to Chicanos to act. They have never, ever given you any money. They don't give Black people money. As much as they talk, they don't give Black people money. But I mean, to me, and that's why I like to use the Bloomberg example. He gave money to Vote Latino. I'm saying that wrong, I can't remember, but he gave money to them. He gave money to Fair Fight. Not even the amount of money they gave to the Lincoln Project. Look what we did with some money, not a bunch of money, but look what we did with a fraction. Jesus, if they just gave us 10% of what they spend on white people. But I'm saying that shows how much power we have. And people are like, oh, upset and blah, blah, blah. I'm like, no, this showed if you give us money, we can take over this whole country. We don't have to let this happen. We can have a 50-state, I said this, and I hate the fact that I gotta use Bloomberg for this. It's killing me, but I have to, because I'm not gonna let them starve us, because that's what they're gonna try to do, call us like the magical person of color who just does things for free. Because Bloomberg essentially was a model of a 50-state strategy. We cannot afford to just write off, they just wrote off Arizona. Oh, we can't win Arizona. We can't win Texas. We can't win the South. You got all of these Chicanos and Native Americans in the Southwest, and you're telling me, and they vote 70% Democrat every single year for the last 10 years. You're telling me you can't win that? No, I reject that. The majority of Black people live in the South, and you're telling me you can't flip that? I am rejecting that idea. I'm rejecting the idea that the centrists use Black people in the South to pick the candidate. They pay them in nothing. I'm not gonna even use what I usually use them in-house, but they pay them no money, and they use them to pick the centrist candidate. They don't advocate for them, still voter suppression, all of this horrible racism, and they just kind of you do a good job. I reject this old-fashioned idea that you can just use Black people for the primary to pick what, I mean, I'm letting it go. I'm letting the whole Bernie thing go. But I feel truthfully, if we had a media, we would do something. I mean, to me, this was so hopeful. This was like, if people would listen, it's to me. The thing is, I take people's data, I take academics, I take all your stuff, and I go, look at what we did. But the thing is that there's a vested interest in making people depressed and making them think, well, all these white people have voted against, but there are a lot of white people who didn't. There are a lot of Black people who came out. There are a lot of Native Americans who came out. There are a lot of Chicanos that came out. So I'm not letting them take that from me. And like you said, with the colleges, it's so funny, you know, they used to fund colleges. Well, you know these, you know, I'm talking to the audience. I know you guys know, but they funded college. They did that. It wasn't expensive, but as soon as the Civil Rights Act passed and Black and Chicano, and I'm not just adding Chicano in there, that's true. Black and Chicano graduation rates started going through the roof. Like, we could go to college, awesome, amazing. They started to fund it, try to make it look like it was welfare for Black and Mexican people. And so we don't want to fund it. So this is another reason why they don't like college. Oh, all these radical people of color going around, you know, having degrees and giving people strategies and writing books. We got to end this, you know, we got to kill this now. So, I mean, I think that's, you know, I'm really hopeful. So they can try to do that, all that Washington Post a week. I'm so very angry. And I mean, and I love AOC. I think she's an amazing person, and they're always trying to come for her. It really makes me angry. Like, I mean, the thing is that, you know, they told, and I'll stop, but they told us, they said, oh, everybody, we're gonna work together. We're gonna be cool. We're not gonna fight. And the day before the results came out, they came out with that BS in the week. Oh, the left got crushed. Oh, I mean, oh, you told us to be nice, and now you want to play games. Now when we had to come back and fight you, because AOC said that after the week article, the left was crushed. So they're trying to also paint her like, oh, well, she started it. She started the first. No, you, the centrist, you started with the first shot. You started off, and with that, you know, with that Lincoln Project, I'm still mad about. They let Graham keep that seat. Were you gonna try to slut shame a white Southerner? They owned slaves and had children with them. And what if children walked around? How are you gonna slut shame that? You can't slut shame a white man in the South. That doesn't make any sense. But I'm done.
No, I mean, I'll just make the comment and then I'll leave it right there. There was that study that came out a few years ago that showed that they were looking at different political attitudes and positions and their attitudes towards democracy. And what they found was that the people most hostile to democratic consensus making in institutions are people who identify as centrists. Those people are much more likely to want to have some kind of authoritarian control over government and not deal with the kind of messiness that goes on in democratic politics in general. So it's really interesting, the kind of demonization of extremists and particularly of leftists, right? Those groups don't necessarily, I mean, of course, you know, the far right doesn't care about democracy, right? But not far behind them are people who identify as moderates or centrists. And so, but this makes me think then, so we're talking about the kind of hopeful picture that we can sort of think about moving ahead. And it's one, as you're saying, grounded in an ethic of solidarity, working to try to figure out how do we empower grassroots communities to do the kind of work, particularly BIPOC communities, and how do we get them to show up? How do we ignore the social media narrative? How do we force democratic leaders in the Democratic Party to take BIPOC communities seriously? I mean, there's a variety of different kinds of things here we can talk about. So I guess the kind of question that I have is, what should we be talking about now in order to focus on justice and moving ahead with the power of communities of color? Alejandro, you mentioned talking about, you know, bringing energy into higher ed and talking about social justice there. One thing, and maybe this is a conversation we can have at a later point, it seems as though when we talk about these kinds of issues, though, when we talk about justice and social justice in the United States, it's about a very sort of certain kind of thing, about representation, of getting, you know, BIPOC folks into positions of power. We don't talk often about class. We don't talk about economic justice very much. And I'm appreciative of both of you bringing those kinds of concerns into the conversation. Right, but frequently when social justice is talked about, it's talked about like, well, how do we bring representation and people into power in various ways? Which is not to say that representation is not important, but you know, our notions of social justice seem to be very narrow. So what should we be focused on when we talk about justice in the United States today? You know, and are there particular issues or campaigns or trends that we can start thinking about in order to really get us into a vibrant discussion of moving ahead for social justice in the US? Alejandro, we'll start with you.
Sure. I think one of the things that we have to be uh, on the left, as an active left, is opportunistic. And one of the things that I think I've been doing on my campus has really been pushing the fact that now everybody on my campus, even the former racist people from 2 semesters ago, are now saying anti-racism and social justice. So that is something that I think is really key in terms of, then we have to redefine what that is, because if not, it will be gentrified, right? It will be, as I've been telling people, right? Our communities are demanding Little Richard, and our leaders are giving us Pat Boone, right? They're giving us the most sanitized, safe, bleached out, social justice, right? And what it's turned into in terms of the dominant definition of social justice is that Sally Struthers, feed the children, is very pity, paternalistic, very safe, right? Oh, it's charity, right? Let's help these, children of a lesser God, and and let's really, uplift them, right? They've turned it into a missionary project, right? That this is some sort of missionaries going out and saving the unclean or whatever. And I think we have to step in and say, no, this is about fundamental social restructuring. Things have to change. And when we do that, then that's when the students get excited, right? Because think about, what do we turn college into? Get a major that looks like a job so that you can get a job, right? And we have stripped down the whole idea that you go to college, right? And I always think about Junot Diaz talking about his idea of going to college was to really learn about himself and the world, right? These questions like, yeah, but you can't get a job in that, right? And the fact that we, right, at the time when people of color now are coming into college, we're now saying, no, this is about you being a worker, right? How ironic, right? It's like, oh, we have to be a worker now. We can't be intellectual. So it's about getting us ready for the workforce only, right? Where is the social responsibility? Where is the the ethics and the character issues, right? One of the things that I constantly am doing, and one of the things I'm teaching in one of my classes this semester is I've been teaching different reproductive rights and sterilization cases and so on and so forth. And the one thing that I do, and I don't gloss over it, is the fact that how did this get exposed? There was somebody who stood up, right, against all the powers, against all the dominance, and said, enough, I'm going to out this. I'm going to be the whistleblower, right? And I tell my students, are you going to do this? Because still in 2020, chances are you will enter a profession, you will be the only people of color around that table. Are you going to blow a whistle? And what does that mean, right? Because then you have to explain to your parents, I'm out of a job because I'm a whistleblower, right? Because I still find that strange that we punish the whistleblower first and then we kind of do the investigation, right? But we really have to think about, right? How do we look at this moment and build a movement, change values, right? Because I think back to the social media thing, I think that is absolutely focusing us on consumerism. It's focusing us on kind of the Kardashian culture in terms of, I am just 1 or 2 viral moments away from being a millionaire, right? And it's about getting people to say, is that all we're about, right? Is that all we're about? We have to figure out how, right? And for Latinx students, and I will only speak to that population of Mexican American background, they're always talking about their families, right? And also my Central American students, because those are the large populations I work with. They're talking about their parents and the communities. And it is a tragic disconnect at so many universities that they come in. Why are they there? Many of them are not there for careers or making millions of dollars. They're there for their communities, right? I always say, well, why are you here? I'm here to help my community. And it's like, well, picking up a broom and sweeping in our communities, that's helping our community, right? Well, what is it that you want to do? How do you find what your calling is, your vocation? And many of the students are like, well, I'm not getting that in this major that's ridiculously popular, over enrolled, right? They never talk about race. They never talk about poverty. They never talk about my people. I don't see myself reflected in any of the readings, even though they could. So, and then when we do show up, of course, we always show up as deficient or pathological, but that's another issue. But our students are really craving, right? Craving this moment of, fundamental change of the structures, and we need leaders to do it, right? And I think that's why, for me, especially in ethnic studies, this is one of the side effects of being an ethnic studies graduate, is people become leaders, right? Defined broadly, either in their jobs or in their communities, they become leaders. So I think it is that ability to take advantage of the time and let's put out the real definition of anti-racism. Let's put out, what universities should be doing, and not mass producing a bunch of workers.
So we need to think big, is what you're saying, and our demands should be big.
Absolutely. Now is the time.
Teka, what do you think? What should we be talking about right now if we want to push ahead with a really strong movement for racial, economic, social justice?
I think it can't be underestimated, the power of media. I know I was from, you can only use your, I'm going to use this for anecdote because it's kind of hopeful and uplifting. I have my little newspaper in Inglewood, and I had writers. I had Black and Mexican American writers, because that's who lives there. And I paid them money. And we actually talked about the environment. We talked about social policy. I showed the little senior women how to use their cameras to film people. I said, you don't have to give your name if you speak at a public event, because a lot of them were from the South and they're very compliant. I talked about rights. My newspaper, and the thing is that it changed. Media is so important, and people underestimate the importance of media. But you should see, look at all the racists that we've created using media. But you can create people who are anti-racist too, using media. And my community was educated, they were informed, and then they gave my competitor $500,000 so that I couldn't exist. But I'm saying, that's how powerful it was. People were like, well, aren't you upset? Actually, no, that shows I was really effective. But that means that you could be really effective everywhere. And also too, I challenged Black and Chicano writers who are journalists. Number one, you can just be a writer. Don't do what white people always try to make you. You're an activist and you're a scholar. People say, oh, you're a scholar. I'm like, no, I'm not a scholar. I don't have a PhD. Just because you don't know a name for me. And I'm also not an activist, because that's not what I do. I'm a writer. And your job as a writer is to inform people, but also it's not just to speak from your behind, I cite people. I go, oh, let me find an anti-racist, anti-capitalist person. Your job is not just, well, I think this, and this. And this hot take, personal narrative stuff has got to stop. Everybody, because that's the thing. You know what? I'll tell you something. And when I wrote for Time magazine, this is why they always have to get rid of me, because I was writing about policy in South Central Los Angeles. And they first wanted me to call it South LA. I was writing about policy in South Central, economic policy. I wasn't talking about race. I wasn't talking about anything. They essentially edited my piece so that it wasn't observational in regards to fact, but it was personal. It was my personal narrative. And they do that, and then they trick you. That's how they get you. Oh, we'll make you a star, and it's about your perspective. Well, the thing is, if it's a personal narrative, how can you cite that? You can't cite a personal opinion. That's why I don't write personal narratives. I write observation. We need more Black and Chicano people who are writing observations, not hot takes. We need observations, and you need to cite scholars when you do this. You can't just write, and that's the two, be conscious. Stop sharing the Forbes magazine. Stop it. Stop sharing Newsweek. They're racist. What is wrong with people? I'm sorry. I'm like, I'm saying, be informed. So I think, okay, so we need to have the fairness doctrine. We need to restate that. You can't just lie 24/7 on our public utilities, because the airways are our public utilities. And we need to get rid of Citizens United. Look at this, I'm sorry. And you get rid of Citizens United. These are things that I think are important for me in my field, education, media, and be conscious of what you're writing and what you're sharing, because people are looking at it and viewing you as a leader in some form. So
So, you know, we need to be conscious about how we shape minds, right? Both of you, I think, are saying is that we need to be conscious of the ways in which we shape minds, we create leaders, and be aware of the kinds of social and particularly economic power that constrains the way that we talk together about how to make our communities strong and resilient in the face of all the things that are damaging to it. Well, I think that this has been really informative to me. Thank you very much. I appreciate your time on all of this. I hope that we can have you both back at some point. I know, Teka, I'm always asking you for stuff, but I hope that we can have you both back to sort of comment on future developments as we move ahead, see where our society is perhaps in the next couple of months. A lot of things are unsure right now, but I appreciate your perspectives and thinking about how solidarity right now is something that we need to focus on. So thank you both for your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
And thank you all for listening and coming in and sharing. If you have any comments, please go ahead and leave them down below. If you would like to get a hold of us at the Anarres Project, you can find us on our social media. Ironically enough, we are on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. You can also find us at our website, which is anarresproject.org. But please go ahead and leave us your thoughts about where you think we might be able to move ahead. Thank you both again, and hope to see you very soon, and be safe, both of you.
Thank you. My honor.
Mhm.